See this timestamp on the screen? This is the exact second he planted the gun. I'm uploading it now. What if I told you that the only witness to the perfect crime was the one person nobody thought was worth watching? This is the shocking story of the Korean dragon, a king of the underworld who was framed for a murder he didn't commit, only to lose his freedom in a heartbeat. And Tanisha, the woman in the crisp navy blue maid's uniform who became his only hope. A woman who used invisibility as a weapon, a man too arrogant to look past the apron, and one digital file that changed the fate of an empire forever. Stay with me because by the end of this story, you will realize that justice doesn't always come from a judge or a jury. Sometimes, the fiercest warrior is standing right in front of you, holding a mop and waiting for the right moment to strike. You'll understand why the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you ignore. This is a story of calculated betrayal, high-tech espionage, and an unlikely bond that bridged the gap between a cold prison cell and a luxury penthouse. Welcome back. Before we unlock the evidence, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever been the only one who knew the truth when everyone else believed a lie? I'd love to hear your story. You know, power has a funny way of making us blind to the snakes hiding in the grass. Especially when we think we're untouchable. Let me tell you about Suksung Park. The heavy doors burst open, and the room filled with shouting men in dark suits. Suksung Park stood still behind his desk, his face like stone. He was known as the Dragon, a man who never showed fear, but now the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. The sound echoed in the silent room. As the police began to pull him away, Park turned his head slowly. He looked at his loyal guards and his trusted advisors. He was searching for one pair of eyes that would offer him hope or a sign of a plan. Instead, every man looked down at the floor. They were afraid to even look at their falling leader. Their silence was the deepest betrayal. Only Tanisha, the quiet maid standing in the corner with her cleaning rag, did not look away. She watched him with wide, steady eyes. Park saw her, and for a split second, a flash of surprise crossed his face. He was the most powerful man in the city, and now the only person brave enough to meet his gaze was the woman who polished his floors. Then, the officers shoved him out the door and into the cold night. The ink on the arrest report was not even dry before Kim Seo Cruz walked into the grand office. He did not knock. He simply sat in Park's leather chair and put his muddy boots up on the mahogany desk. He looked like a king who had finally stolen a crown. He called the entire household staff into the room, ranging from the cooks to the drivers. The air felt heavy with worry. Cruz leaned forward, a cruel smile stretching across his face. He told them that things were changing immediately. Because of the trouble Park had caused, everyone would have their pay cut by half. A low murmur of shock went through the crowd, but Cruz slammed his hand on the desk to silence them. He wanted them to feel small and helpless. He wasn't just trying to save money, he was showing them who was the boss now. He looked at their tired faces and laughed, enjoying the power he had over their lives. He told them to get back to work or they would end up in a cell right next to their old master. Tanisha waited until the mansion was quiet and the hallways were dim. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She crept toward the office, her footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. Earlier, she had hidden a small camera behind a stack of books for her own protection, fearing Cruz's temper. Now, she reached behind the shelf and pulled the tiny device into her palm. Her hands shook as she pressed the play button on the small screen. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to see the truth. She watched as Cruz entered the office alone. He looked around to make sure he was solo, then pulled a heavy, blood-stained knife from under his coat. With a wicked grin, he tucked the weapon deep into the secret drawer of Park's desk. Tanisha gasped, covering her mouth to stay silent. This was the murder weapon the police were looking for. Park didn't kill anyone. Cruz was framing him. She tucked the camera into her apron, knowing this little piece of plastic was now the most dangerous thing in the world. As Tanisha turned to leave the room, a shadow blocked the doorway. It was Cruz. He was leaning against the frame, watching her with sharp, suspicious eyes. The hallway was dark, and Tanisha felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What are you doing in here so late, girl?" he hissed, stepping closer until he was looming over her. Tanisha dropped her head immediately. She let her shoulders slump and made her hands tremble visibly. She squeezed the camera tight inside her pocket, hiding it in the folds of her uniform. "I'm so sorry, sir," she whimpered, using her best dumb servant voice. "I forgot to dust the top shelf, and I was scared you would be angry with me tomorrow." She looked up at him with wide, watery eyes, acting like a girl who could barely read, let alone solve a crime. Cruz stared at her for a long minute, searching for any sign of a lie. Finally, he snorted and pushed her shoulder. "Get out of here, you useless brat," he spat. Tanisha scurried past him, keeping her head down until she reached the safety of her small room. The prison smelled like damp concrete and old metal. Tanisha sat on the other side of the thick glass, waiting for Park to appear. When the guards finally brought him out, she barely recognized him. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit, and his hair was messy. He looked broken, like a man who had given up on the world. Tanisha picked up the phone, and Park did the same, his hand shaking. He didn't say a word, he just looked at her with hollow eyes. Tanisha leaned in close to the glass, her voice a tiny, sharp whisper. "I have the lens, Mr. Park," she said firmly. Park's eyes suddenly cleared, and he gripped the phone tighter. He knew she meant the camera. He started to speak, but she cut him off before the guards could hear. "Listen to me closely," she whispered, her face turning serious. "The people here are not your friends. Don't eat the food they give you tonight. Someone wants to make sure you never go to trial." Park nodded slowly, a spark of the old dragon returning to his gaze. He finally had an ally. Inside the cold, gray cell, a guard slid a plastic tray through the slot in the door. The smell of the hot stew was tempting, and Park's stomach groaned with hunger. He reached for the spoon, his hand shaking from exhaustion. Then, he remembered Tanisha's wide, steady eyes and her sharp whisper through the glass. He pulled his hand back, as if the tray were on fire. Instead of eating, he waited until the guard walked away and then dumped the stew down the small drain in the corner of the floor. Within minutes, a stray cockroach scurried across the tiles and nibbled on a drop of the spilled liquid. Park watched in horror as the insect suddenly froze and flipped over, dead in seconds. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Tanisha had saved his life. He sat back against the hard wall, realizing that his powerful friends had all turned into ghosts. The only person in the world he could trust was a maid who worked in the shadows. He was the dragon, but she was his only shield. Back at the penthouse, Tanisha sat on the edge of her small bed with her laptop glowing in the dark. She plugged in the camera and found the file showing Cruz planting the knife. Her heart raced as she clicked the button to upload the video to the police headquarters. A red bar appeared on the screen. Connection failed. She tried again, then again, but the result was the same. She checked the signal and realized the truth. Cruz had installed a high-tech jammer in the building. He had turned the luxury penthouse into a digital cage. No emails could go out, and no phone calls could reach the world. She was trapped in a beautiful prison with a video that could change everything, but she had no way to send it. She looked at the heavy door to her room. She knew it was only a matter of time before Cruz realized she was more than just a girl with a dusting cloth. She had to get out of the building before the sun came up. Tanisha didn't panic. Instead, she reached under her narrow cot and pulled out a heavy black duffel bag. She unzipped it, revealing gear that no ordinary maid would ever own. There was a tactical vest, a set of lockpicks, and a scrambled radio. Tanisha wasn't just a servant from a small village. Years ago, she had been a top witness protection officer in Atlanta. She had spent her life hiding people from dangerous criminals until a mission went wrong, and she had to hide herself in Seoul. She pulled on a dark hoodie and strapped a combat knife to her leg. The dumb servant act was over. She felt the familiar weight of the gear and felt her fear turn into cold, hard focus. She had spent months cleaning Park's floors and watching his every move, waiting for a reason to care again. Now, she had a mission. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to take Cruz down and prove that the dragon was innocent. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots thundered in the hallway. Cruz's mercenaries were not knocking, they were kicking in doors. Tanisha grabbed her bag and moved like a shadow. She knew she couldn't use the elevator, so she sprinted toward the laundry room. The men burst into her quarters, but all they found was an empty bed and an open window. Tanisha threw her bag into the deep laundry chute and jumped in right after it. She tumbled down 3 floors, landing on a pile of soft linens. She scrambled out, grabbed her gear, and ran toward the basement garage. She found a dusty service bike leaning against the wall. With a quick kick, the engine roared to life. She sped through the exit just as the garage doors began to slam shut. The bright neon lights of Seoul blurred past her as she swerved through the midnight traffic. The mercenaries were right behind her in black SUVs, but Tanisha knew these streets better than they did. She vanished into the glowing maze of the city. Tanisha pulled the bike into a dark alley and took a deep breath. She needed a fast internet connection, so she headed toward a PC Bang, a 24-hour internet cafe tucked away in a basement. The room was filled with the blue light of 100 screens and the clicking of keyboards. She found a corner desk and slid her disk into the computer. She began to encrypt the video file, so no one could steal it or change it. However, when she tried to send the file to her old contacts in America, her heart sank. The file was huge because of the high quality, and the public Wi-Fi was too slow to handle it. A timer on the screen told her it would take 6 hours to finish the upload. She didn't have 6 hours. She looked at the door, watching for any sign of Cruz's men. She was stuck in the middle of the city with the evidence in her hand, but the clock was ticking and the shadows were closing in. In the quiet office, Kim Seo Cruz stared at the empty space on the bookshelf. He realized the tiny camera was gone, and his face turned a deep shade of red. He checked the security tapes and saw Tanisha vanishing into the night. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. If that video reached the public, his life would be over. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, shaking the glass of water sitting there. He grabbed his phone and called his most dangerous contacts. "I want her found now," he roared into the receiver. He told them he would pay $5 million to anyone who brought her to him. It didn't matter if she was alive or dead. Within minutes, the word spread through the criminal underworld of Seoul. Every hunter, thief, and mercenary in the city began looking for a girl in a maid's uniform. Tanisha was no longer just a runaway. She was the most expensive target in the country. Cruz paced the room, knowing that as long as she had that footage, he was never truly safe. Tanisha hid in the shadows of a narrow alley, her heart racing. Suddenly, her burner phone buzzed with a private message. It was from Min-hee, Park's young daughter. Tanisha had spent many afternoons protecting the girl and helping her with her homework. "I saw what Cruz did," the message read. Tanisha felt a surge of hope. She met the girl behind a quiet temple where the air smelled like incense. Min-hee was trembling, but she held out a small piece of paper. "My father gave me a second copy of his cloud password," she whispered. "He told me to only give it to someone I trusted with my life. He said you were the only one left." Tanisha took the paper, realizing this was the missing piece of the puzzle. The password would unlock Park's private server, allowing her to upload the video directly to a secure network that Cruz couldn't touch. She hugged the brave girl quickly, promising to bring her father home. The battle was no longer just about survival. It was about family and a promise kept. The peace of the night was shattered by the roar of engines. Tanisha had been spotted. She jumped onto her service bike and kicked it into gear just as 3 black motorcycles screeched around the corner. The chase led them into the heart of the Gangnam district, where the giant neon screens turned the streets into a blur of color. Tanisha leaned low over the handlebars, weaving through the crowded traffic at high speeds. The hunters were gaining on her, their tires screaming as they took tight turns. One of the riders pulled alongside her and tried to kick her front wheel, but Tanisha slammed on her brakes, letting him fly past. She zoomed into a narrow pedestrian walkway, scattering shoppers and dodging food stalls. Her hands were steady on the grips, her old training from Atlanta taking over. She flew over a set of stairs and landed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could see the flashing lights of the police station ahead. She hoped that the law would finally be on her side. Tanisha skidded to a halt in front of the police station and ran inside, clutching the camera. She demanded to see the captain, breathing hard from the chase. A tall man with a cold expression led her into a private room. "I have proof that Park is innocent," she said, holding up the device. The captain took the camera and looked at it, but he didn't look surprised. Instead, he dropped it into a drawer and pulled out his radio. "I have the girl," he said calmly. Tanisha's blood ran cold. She realized too late that the captain was on Cruz's payroll. He wasn't a hero. He was just another man bought with Cruz's money. 2 officers moved to block the door, but Tanisha didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy chair and threw it through the glass window. Before they could grab her, she dived through the shattered frame and rolled onto the sidewalk. She scrambled to her feet and disappeared into the dark, realizing that even the police were now her enemies. Exhausted and alone, Tanisha found a public payphone near the docks. She dialed the prison's main line, hoping to hear Park's voice one last time. When he picked up, his voice sounded weak and tired. "The weather in the north is very cold," Park said suddenly. It sounded like nonsense, but Tanisha recognized it immediately. It was a secret code they had talked about once while she was cleaning his study. He was telling her exactly where his loyalists were hiding. They were the men who had stayed true to him but had been forced into hiding when Cruz took over. "Check the old warehouse near the north gate," he added before the guard cut the line. Tanisha hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had no camera and no friends in the police, but she had a location. She knew she had to find these men before Cruz's hunters found her. The dragon had sent his final message, and Tanisha was the only one who could lead the counterattack to save him. Tanisha reached the North Gate warehouse. Inside, the old guard of the Park clan sat in the shadows. These were big, tough men who had served the dragon for years. When Tanisha stepped into the light, they laughed. "The boss sent a maid to lead us," one man sneered, standing up to block her path. He didn't believe a foreigner could understand their ways or lead a fight. Tanisha didn't waste time talking. When the man tried to grab her arm, she moved like lightning. She used his own weight to flip him onto the hard concrete floor. Before the others could move, she had another man in a headlock. Her eyes were cold and sharp, showing the skills she had learned back in Atlanta. The room went silent. They realized she wasn't just a girl who cleaned floors. She was a warrior. The men stood up and bowed their heads slowly. They finally respected her. They saw the fire of the dragon in her spirit. "Tell us the plan," the leader said. Tanisha straightened her hoodie and looked at the map. The time for hiding was over, and the time for war had begun. The plan was dangerous, but it was their only hope. Tanisha and the loyalists gathered around a table to plan a raid on the Park Group headquarters. The tall building was a fortress of glass and steel. To save Mr. Park, they had to reach the main server room on the top floor. Tanisha explained that they couldn't just walk in the front door. "We will use the service elevators and the ventilation shafts," she whispered. Her goal was to plug her device into the main computer and broadcast the murder video live to every screen in the city. The men checked their radios and tightened their boots. They knew that if they failed, none of them would walk out alive. Tanisha felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. She was leading these men into a trap, but it was the only way to expose Cruz's lies. They moved out into the rainy night, slipping through the dark streets like ghosts. The tower loomed above them, glowing with light, waiting for the battle to start. Tanisha took a deep breath and led the way into the belly of the beast. As they moved through the dark hallways of the headquarters, Tanisha felt something was wrong. One of the loyalists, a man named Jiro, kept checking his watch and looking at his phone. Tanisha didn't know that Jiro was actually Cruz's secret brother. He had been a spy inside the Park clan for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. While Tanisha was busy bypassing a security lock, Jiro stepped into a corner and sent a quick text message. "They are in the building," he typed. Moving to the server room now. Cruz received the message and smiled in his office. He called his guards and told them to get their guns ready. He was going to end this tonight. Back in the hallway, Tanisha noticed Jiro's nervous behavior. She saw the glow of his phone screen reflecting in a window. Before she could say anything, the red emergency lights began to flash and a loud siren echoed through the building. They were trapped. Jiro pulled out a gun and pointed it at Tanisha, a wicked grin on his face. "The game is over," he hissed. The doors to the server room slammed shut, and Cruz walked out from behind a row of computers. He looked at Tanisha and laughed, holding a cigar in his hand. His guards surrounded the loyalists, who were forced to drop their weapons. Cruz walked up to Tanisha and grabbed her by the hair. "You thought you were so smart," he mocked. He reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. He held it up for everyone to see, then threw it onto the hard floor. He stamped on it with his heavy boot until the screen shattered into 1,000 pieces and the lights inside died. "There goes your evidence," Cruz bragged. "Now no one will ever see that video." Tanisha didn't scream or cry. She just stood there, looking at the broken pieces of plastic on the ground. Cruz thought he had won. He thought he had destroyed the only thing that could stop him. He leaned in close to her face, his breath smelling like expensive wine. "You're just a maid, Tanisha. You were never a match for me." Tanisha looked him in the eye and smiled. Cruz stopped laughing when he saw Tanisha's smile. "Why are you happy?" he barked, feeling a sudden surge of fear. Tanisha reached into the secret lining of her apron and pulled out a small, blinking light. "That phone you just broke was a dummy," she said calmly. "I bought it at the market for $10. She showed him a tiny satellite uplink hidden under her clothes. It was already connected to the building's main antenna. "The real video isn't on a phone, Cruz. It's being sent to the world right now." Suddenly, every television in the office turned on. The footage of Cruz planting the knife played on a loop for the entire city to see. Even the guards stared at the screens in shock. The truth was out, and there was no way to take it back. Cruz screamed in rage and reached for his gun, but it was too late. The sound of police helicopters filled the air outside the window. Tanisha stood tall as the dragon's enemies began to crumble. She had finished the job. The maid had finally taken down the king. The lights in the tower flickered once, and then died. Outside, the bright neon signs of Seoul vanished, and the giant television screens showing the video went black. Cruz stood in the middle of the room, his face lit only by the pale moon. He had used his secret codes to shut down the entire city's power grid. "If I can't hide the truth, I will make the world go blind," he screamed. The silence that followed was terrifying. Without the hum of computers or the roar of traffic, the building felt like a tomb. Cruz's guards stood frozen, holding their guns and looking around in fear. They couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. Cruz laughed, thinking that the darkness would protect him. He believed that without electricity, Tanisha was just a girl lost in a big building. He didn't know that the darkness was where she felt most at home. While the city slept in shadows, Tanisha stayed perfectly still, waiting for her moment to strike. She knew the layout of the room by heart, and she was ready for the final fight. Tanisha reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a pair of night vision goggles. She slid them over her eyes, and suddenly the world turned into a bright, ghostly green. She could see everything clearly, while Cruz's guards were stumbling over chairs and whispering in panic. Tanisha moved like a ghost through the server room. She didn't use a gun. She used her hands and the shadows. One by one, the guards felt a tap on their shoulder or a foot behind their heel. Before they could cry out, Tanisha had them on the ground, tied up and silent. She was a shadow among shadows, dismantling Cruz's small army with the skill of a professional. Cruz spun around, firing his gun into the empty air, but he was hitting nothing but walls. He could hear his men falling, but he couldn't see who was taking them down. He realized he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey. Tanisha watched him through her green lens, circling him like a predator. She was closing the gap, and Cruz was running out of time. At the same time, miles away, the prison was also falling into chaos. When the power went out, the electronic locks on the cell doors clicked open. This was the signal the loyalists inside had been waiting for. A loud roar went up from the inmates as a riot began to fill the hallways. Guards ran in every direction, trying to restore order, but the crowd was too big. In the middle of the smoke and shouting, Park's most trusted men found him in his cell. They didn't say a word. They just handed him a heavy jacket and a radio. They moved through the dark corridors, avoiding the main gates. They led Park toward the infirmary, where a secret exit led to the delivery docks. Park moved with a new strength, his heart pounding with the hope of freedom. He could hear the sirens of the city outside, but he kept his focus on the door. He was no longer a broken prisoner. He was a leader again, and he was coming back to claim what was stolen from him. Tanisha pushed the heavy doors open and stepped onto the rooftop. The wind was cold, and the dark city of souls stretched out below them like a dead giant. Cruz was waiting there, standing near the edge of the building. He held his gun tight, but his hands were shaking. "Why did you do it?" Tanisha asked, her voice steady and calm. Cruz spat on the ground and glared at her. Park was getting soft, he hissed. The dragon was becoming a grandfather, talking about peace and helping the poor. The modern world needs a monster, not a saint. I did what was necessary to keep the clan strong. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with a crazy light. He felt that the old ways were dead and that he was the only one brave enough to lead with blood and fear. Tanisha saw the sadness in his words. He had betrayed his friend because he didn't understand that true strength comes from loyalty, not cruelty. He raised his gun to her head, ready to end the story once and for all. Cruz pulled the trigger back, but a heavy hand suddenly grabbed his wrist. Out of the shadows stepped a man in a tattered prison jumpsuit. It was Suksung Park. His face was covered in dirt and his eyes were tired, but the fire of the dragon was burning brighter than ever before. Cruz gasped, his face turning white with fear. He tried to pull his arm away, but Park's grip was like iron. "You think peace is a weakness, Kim Seo?" Park asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You forgot that a dragon only sleeps, he never dies." With a powerful move, Park twisted the gun out of Cruz's hand and pushed him back away from Tanisha. Park stood between the maid and the traitor, his shoulders broad and his head held high. The power of the city might have been out, but the light of the true leader was blinding. Tanisha stepped back, breathing hard, as she watched the two men face each other. The dragon had finally returned to his mountain, and he was ready to finish the fight that Cruz had started. Suddenly, a deep hum filled the air as the backup generators roared to life. All at once, the city of Seoul began to glow again. The darkness was pushed back by a wave of bright light. On the rooftop, the giant screens that lined the building suddenly flickered. The video of Cruz planting the bloody knife began to play on every single billboard in the city. From the busy streets of Gangnam to the bright lights of Times Square, the world saw the truth. People stopped their cars in the middle of the road to watch. They saw Cruz's wicked smile as he framed his own friend. The evidence was everywhere, and no one could hide it anymore. Cruz looked around at the screens, his face turning as white as a sheet. He tried to cover his eyes, but the images were too large to ignore. Tanisha stood by the edge of the roof, watching the truth spread like a wildfire. The digital cage was broken, and the power of the lie was finally gone. The world knew the dragon was innocent, and the traitor had nowhere left to run or hide. The sound of several helicopters drowned out the wind as the High Council of the Underworld arrived. These were the most powerful leaders in the country, the men who truly decided who ruled the streets. They landed their black choppers on the roof and stepped out, their faces stern and cold. They looked at the giant screens and then at Cruz, who was trembling on the floor. The leader of the council stepped forward and looked Cruz in the eye. "You have broken the most important rule," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "You betrayed your brother with a lie." With a quick motion, they stripped Cruz of his golden ring and his title. He was no longer a boss, he was nothing. The council members turned to Park and bowed deeply, showing their respect for the true dragon. They handed Cruz over to Park, giving him the power to do whatever he wanted with the man who had ruined his life. Cruz begged for mercy, but the men who once feared him now looked away in disgust. His time as a king was over. Park looked down at Cruz, his hand tightening into a fist. For a second, it looked like the dragon was going to take a violent revenge. The air was thick with tension, and the council members waited for the blood to spill. But then, Park looked over at Tanisha. He remembered her words about doing things the right way and the legitimate path she always encouraged. He took a deep breath and slowly opened his hand. "I am not a murderer like you," Park said firmly. Instead of ending Cruz, he signaled to the honest police officers who were finally arriving on the roof. He chose to hand Cruz over to the law. This was a huge twist that shocked the council. By choosing the legal path, Park was ending the cycle of violence. He was proving that he was a different kind of leader. Tanisha felt a surge of pride as she watched the officers lead a crying Cruz away in handcuffs. The dragon had won the battle, but more importantly, he had won his soul back. He was finally a free man in every way that mattered. A few weeks later, Park sat in his rebuilt office, which was now filled with sunlight instead of shadows. He looked at Tanisha and offered her a fancy gold pen. "You saved my life and my family," he said with a smile. "I want you to be my chief operations officer. You will have a huge salary and a big office of your own." Tanisha looked at the offer, then looked out the window at the city. She thought about her time as a maid and her life in Atlanta. "Thank you, Mr. Park," she said softly, "but I have a different dream." She explained that she didn't want to be a corporate boss. Instead, she wanted to use the reward money to start a special school for kids who grew up without families or homes. She wanted to help underprivileged children find their own strength before they fell into a life of crime. Park was surprised, but then he nodded with great respect. He realized that Tanisha was still teaching him how to be a better person. She wasn't just his protector, she was his greatest teacher. 6 months had passed since the night the city went dark. The neon lights of Seoul were bright and beautiful. Park was now a respected and legitimate businessman, working hard to help the city grow. Tanisha stood on the balcony of a beautiful new building, which was the headquarters of her foundation. She was no longer wearing a maid's uniform. She wore a sharp, professional suit. Park walked out to join her, carrying 2 cups of tea. They stood side by side, looking out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. They didn't speak as boss and servant anymore. They spoke as equals and as the best of friends. The school was full of happy children, and the dragon's business was finally clean and honest. "We did it, Tanisha," Park said, looking at the peaceful city below. Tanisha smiled, feeling the warm wind on her face. She had come to the city to hide, but she had found a family and a purpose instead. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, they both knew that a bright new horizon was waiting for them. This story reminds us that true power isn't about how much money you have or how many guards you hire. It's about the courage to stand up for the truth, even when you are standing alone. Tanisha showed us that you don't need a crown to be a hero. You just need a brave heart. So, the next time you feel small or invisible, remember, even a single candle can conquer the dark. If you enjoyed this ride from the prison cell to the penthouse, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. Who would you want on your team? The fierce dragon or the smart spy? Tell me your choice in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves a good twist, and subscribe for more amazing stories every week. Thanks for watching.